my family and the Blackfoot River, and in the course of doing that, wondered who the first white men were really to see our part of the world. And the first group to see it were Meriwether Lewis and a small band from the expedition on the return journey of the Corps of Discovery in 1806, when they traveled through the Blackfoot Valley, and both Lewis and his sergeant, Patrick Gass, made records of what they saw. There may have been some errant French-Canadian who slipped down from Canada at some point and tasted the waters of the Blackfoot before that, but there's no record of it. Those who don't write don't make it with history. Writers get the last word. Meriwether Lewis went through the Blackfoot Valley in July of 1806, leaving from a spot very near here on the 4th of July, out by Grant Creek, where he had traveled from the day before from Traveler's Rest. He crossed the Clark Fork at some peril, nearly drowned when he was tipped off a raft, made it to shore. No one was seriously injured. And the next day, about noon, after parting with the Indians who had been so friendly and important to the expedition, he set off into the Blackfoot Valley. The Indians refused to go with him because he was heading to Blackfoot Indian country, and that was the enemy. And they warned him against the Blackfeet, and as a consequence, he moved very quickly when he went through the Blackfoot Valley. The second day, he and his party forded the Clearwater, and both he and Sergeant Gass recorded the event. This was when they would have looked to the north, as Patrick Gass surely did, because he said he saw the shining mountains, the snow-covered mountains of the Clearwater drainage. Lewis did not record that observation. They proceeded on. They didn't fish the Blackfoot, they didn't cross the Blackfoot, it was too high. They made it out in 3.5 days, and this expedition got very little attention from historians, because after they got out on the plains, in the Buffalo country, they actually did run into the Blackfeet. Lewis and an even smaller party, he split the party up again, and it turned violent, and he, Lewis, and another member of the expedition killed 2 of the Indians. It's the only time that happened on the whole trip, anything that violent. It was a glancing blow, let's call it that, at the Clearwater. Lewis comments a great deal about the trees, but he doesn't comment about the gigantic larch, because he didn't get up into the larch. He was down in the Blackfoot Valley, where it was mostly, the big trees were the yellow pine, the ponderosa pine, which are still there. There's one very famous one down at the Cottonwood Ranch, if you're familiar with it, where the cottonwood comes into the Blackfoot. That ranch was owned by Patsy Dodge Wilson, who was the widow of Wyatt Dodge, the foreman at Man Gulch. And there's an enormous ponderosa down there that people come from miles around to put their arms around and have their photographs taken, including me. I do that. The larch became an issue at the turn of the century, from the 19th into the 20th century, when there was a first large timber cut at Seeley Lake that lasted from 1907 to 1911. At that time, there was a kind of almost a hippie ranger there, a timber guy by the name of Ambrose Norton, which sounds like something out of a romantic Victorian novel. And that's the way he wrote. It was this very flowery, florid kind of guy. And he wanted to save everything that he saw. All these trees must be saved. A corridor along what is now Route 83 of beautiful larch trees, and forget what the timber people want. Well, they got rid of him. Because, as you know, the national forests were approved by the Western congressional delegations with the understanding that there would be multiple use and that there would be commercial use of the forest, that will not be stopped. And if they hadn't agreed to that, if Teddy Roosevelt hadn't agreed to that and the others, there would have been no unanimity within Congress. It was a coming together of different sides, something we don't see very often today. But they brought in a guy named Jim Gerard, the Forest Service did, who was a timber cruiser. and a very enlightened and a very tough man. And he looked at the situation as the loggers were waiting with baited saw. And he said, we're going to have to provide timber for some of these people, but some of this should be saved. These gigantic larch are special. I've never seen anything quite like this. And he sent a message to the WO, to the Washington office, saying, I think we must compromise and save some of this. At that time, Gifford Pinchot was the chief of the United States Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot had made a trip through the Swan and the Clearwater in 1896 that would have been well understood by Elers Koch. And it was a kind of trip that Elers talks about in High Trails, that wonderful novel that he wrote that we are, Cheryl, we're going to get that one back in print next. Very romantic, high-flown, adventuresome, boy's dream of the outdoors kind of a trip. He started in Kalispell. He'd gotten there doing work for the National Forest Reserve Commission. They didn't know what they had. They didn't know what the national forests were like. There had been very little exploration. The homesteaders were just starting to filter in. There were a few trapper cabins in the Swan, and then a few homesteads down in the Clearwater. So Pinchot started out from Kalispell on foot. A pack train had gotten him to Kalispell, but he'd lost the pack train. He and another fellow started walking through the Swan, and they had a marvelous time. He carried 27 pounds on his back, had a rifle, shot game, sometimes for sport, and he wrote about the whole trip, but never published the full account of it. There's a very brief account of it, a page and a half or so, in Breaking New Ground, his autobiography. But one of the things he talks about in the lengthy account, which Cheryl found at Gray Towers in Pennsylvania, the Pinchot homestead, was he talks about the trees and how magnificent they were. And he understood that this was something special, the larch. They got over the divide between the Clearwater and the Swan, and they were getting kind of worn down. And they walked down to what he calls a beautiful shining lake rippled by the wind, and swam and bathed and set off the next morning. And I think they left the lakes, because he talks about walking 11 miles to the Morrell homestead. And Morrell had a ranch there. It's now Morrell Creek, of course, which some people think is named for the mushroom. It's not. This was a guy. And from there, they set out again the next day, and he said they went 3 miles uphill, and it was the hardest part of the trip. Well, if that's the case, they were not walking along Seeley Lake and then along the shore of Salmon Lake, because there isn't a 3-mile rise. And I think they were over against what is now the boundary of the Bob, Marshall, down in that valley where Morrell Creek runs. And that's how they got down to Morrell, and from there up 3 miles, which he said was the hardest part of the trip, and you can easily imagine a 3-mile run in that area. And then down to Ovando, where they got a stage and went back to Kalispell. This is the Gifford Pinchot who received the message from Jim Gerard saying, we've got to save these trees. So he knew the area, and he saved the trees. And we have today the Jim Gerard Grove of 500 acres, and we also have a lot more in the backcountry if you can find them in the unthinned forest. I have a friend, Peter Hubbard, who's with me at the cabin, and I took him on the walk to the big tree of the Jim Gerard forest yesterday, and then we walked around the perimeter. And as you walk that perimeter, you're in the thinned area where man has imitated repetitive fire and cleared it out. It's starting to regen a lot, and it could use a little more clearing. But then you look at the area that hasn't been treated, and it's a thicket, and it needs treatment. So we owe the presence of the larch to the Forest Service, and we also owe the presence of the larch to the Native Americans who camped in that area, not merely for centuries, but probably for about 3,500 years. And when they left their camps, they were seasonal camps, huckleberry camps, they would light fires, kick over a campfire, let it burn, and they burned all that low stuff out of there, which is how the larch became big in the first place. So when you see those larch, you should thank the United States Forest Service and the people who took care of it for 3,500 years before that. Elers Koch understood a lot of that. He didn't understand it all because the science of the time was not as advanced. But he started doing dendrochronology studies of those larch. And he talks about one in the book where he counted 957 growth rings on a larch. Gus, or the Millennium Tree, that big one that is the #1 tree in North America, #1 Western larch in North America, is a little over 1,000 years. So Elers Koch was counting rings on a tree that was nearly 1,000 years. He was doing it 50, 60, 70 years ago, so we're talking about a tree that today would be 1,000 years. In other words, a partner of Gus. He was a legend. I write about him in the foreword as though he were a mystical Obi-Wan Kenobi kind of figure, which he was for me. And he was for my father. And it was really a mystical experience to meet him. He was late in life. I didn't realize it being a child, but he was very ill, had terrible arthritis. He came up to the cabin, which was next door to ours, for a visit, and it was, oh my God, the old man of the woods is coming to visit. And my father prepared questions for him, and we got all ginned up for this. And we had to wait and delay because he wanted a little private time with his family. And then we went over to his cabin, and he was this wizened figure, a very slight man, and a physical marvel. And he'd walk 10 miles during the day, have dinner, and then let's make it an even 20, and round it out to 10 miles after dinner. Fine horseman, fine outdoorsman. And he was this wizened, elderly figure with huge eyes and a shrunken face, and he got cold, and they took down a buffalo robe off the wall of the cabin, and they wrapped him in this, in a kind of a little pyramid with his head sticking out, with the big goggle eyes looking around, and my father would be asking him questions, and he wouldn't answer. He would just kind of look around. A mystical response. My father got very frustrated and felt very unsatisfied by it. But it's something I've remembered in a spiritual sense ever since, that here was a man who was the mountains and didn't really have to say anything. But when he does say things, when he writes beautifully. I hope you all enjoy his book, and I can't wait to get The High Trail back into print. Thank you.